Bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hey everyone, it's your friendly Amr back from a relaxing weekend getaway at a cottage.
Congrats, Amr, and this is Erin from Buffalo.
Thank you. How's Buffalo?
It's Buffalo.
Well, I didn't know you guys had a museum that had mummies until this episode, so...
Oh, we'll get to that, but welcome to Das Criminal Podcast. For our first-time listeners, hi, nice to meet you. For our returning listeners, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well. Every time we meet you, it's a pleasure.
We do just want to quickly pay our respects to Michael Brooks, a journalist and podcaster who passed away last week. We just want to take a moment to acknowledge that and acknowledge his memory, his impact.
Yeah, one of the most principled and just generally insightful and kind people in the journalist sphere, and I wish his family and friends condolences.
Yes. This episode is our final installment in our Ancient True Crime July extravaganza. We hope that you've been enjoying it so far.
Yeah, we're wrapping up with the big one, the fireworks and all that, so you're in for a hell of a ride.
As you've likely already noticed from the title of our episode and from Amr's mention of mummies, today we're going to be talking about mummies, and in order to support our detailed research, I went to the Buffalo Museum of Science to see a traveling exhibition called Golden Mummies of Egypt, which is summarized as such, quote, Golden Mummies of Egypt examines hopes and fears about the afterlife when Egypt was a part of the Greek and Roman worlds, circa 300 BC to 200 AD. Wealthy members of this multicultural society had their mummified bodies encased in gold in hopes of joining the gods after death, end quote. I have mixed feelings about a traveling exhibit about Egyptian mummies. On the one hand, the artifacts in this exhibit, including the mummies, were mostly found in excavations by British archaeologist and known racist William Flinders Petrie during the British colonial period in Egypt. They are stolen objects, and I am in agreement that looted cultural artifacts from colonial times should be returned to their places of origin. That being said, a ticket into this exhibit was $19, and a round-trip flight from Buffalo to Cairo is presently in the $1,500 range.
That's without counting hotels, I imagine, and,
Right,
food and all
that's
that.
just the flight. So museums which gather these cultural artifacts from all over the world make them accessible to the 99% of people who cannot travel to see them. Still, I think it's a problem that these items are on loan from the Manchester Museum in the UK and not from Egypt. We're going to discuss the politics of museums and antiquities trading a lot more in this episode, but it's just something for you to start thinking about. So, our story begins in mid-October of 2000 in the cosmopolitan city of Karachi, Pakistan, in what might seem like a strange circumstance: a murder investigation. In the course of this investigation, it seems that Karachi police came across a criminal syndicate, and they just happened to find an astonishing video. The tape features a man named Ali Akbar trying to sell something very valuable on the black market: an ancient mummy.
So just to clarify for our listeners, our dear listeners, when we say ancient mummy, we mean the preserved corpse in bandages, not the posh English word for mother.
This mummy immediately became a matter of interest for the police. In Pakistan, as in many places, there are national laws which govern excavations and antiquities trading. Additionally, Pakistan is a signatory to the UNESCO 1970 Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property, meaning that it agrees to protect cultural artifacts through preventative measures, restitution provisions, and international cooperations. If you've flown out of a country that has a lot of antiquities, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, in my own experience, they x-ray your baggage on the way out, including your checked luggage. And one of the things they're looking for is antiquities smuggling, whether it's an individual trying to take home something they found at a site like Petra or some sort of organized looting ring.
So I actually experienced that scenario firsthand, and I just realized the meaning of it. I was flying out of Lisbon, Portugal, but I had initially backpacked my way up through Morocco, crossing the ferry to Spain, backpacking a bit around Spain, and then flying to Lisbon, and then flying out of Lisbon to Toronto. And out of Lisbon, they x-rayed my backpack and found this little fossil that I bought in Morocco off a stall in a town besides the Sahara. I forget the name of the town, but it was on our way out of the Sahara after camping there. And it was a little fossil, and it was wrapped in newspaper. And the airport security, when they saw my bag go through x-ray, basically made me empty my entire bag because this thing was like in the bottom to take out this fossil, which was like the size of your palm. And they examined it for like a good 5 to 10 minutes before letting me through. So, I mean, at the time I was like, oh, they probably thought it was like drugs or whatever. But in the course of researching this episode, I assumed they were just worried I was smuggling artifacts. Though the fact that they let me through probably means that whatever I bought was a fake.
When it comes to ancient artifacts, the rule is definitely not finders keepers, and Pakistan takes this very seriously. Just last week, for instance, Pakistani police arrested 4 men for violation of antiquities laws in connection with the deliberate destruction of a 3rd century Buddha statue that the men had uncovered while doing construction work. Something about this, I just imagine a libertarian angrily being like, if you found that statue, it's yours. You can destroy it.
Listen, you should be free to trade your child for a statue as per libertarian utopia.
So, with the discovery of Ali Akbar's black market mummy commercial, Pakistani police realized they had another investigation on their hands. They interrogated Akbar about the video and the location of the mummy, and he told them that he was trying to sell the mummy on behalf of someone else for the price of anywhere between $1 million and $1 billion US.
For reference, Jeff Bezos is soon to be worth over 1,000 mummies, assuming a price on the higher end for mummies.
I would say Jeff Bezos is worth exactly 1 mummified Jeff Bezos.
Satire, everyone. Satire. All joking here.
The exact amount of this mummy's worth varies widely across news sources, as it doesn't appear that anyone had made a successful bid before the police uncovered the plot. But most source material puts the asking price or offers for the mummy around $11 million US, an amount that archaeologists and museum curators claim wouldn't be outrageous for a wealthy private collector to pay for such a rare ancient artifact.
Interestingly enough, and this is just an aside, rare art and artifacts are also very useful for money laundering. We discussed money laundering in a previous episode with regards to Al-Qaeda using honey stores. But artifacts are also a good way to transport large amounts of dirty money across the borders. So suppose you have $11 million in dirty money that you gained through some illicit activity, let's say drug trafficking or arms dealing. That money is dirty and can be traced to your activities. What you can do is use that money to purchase an expensive artifact or piece of rare art, and then transport that artifact across borders without having to declare its true value or declare the cash to customs. You can even go to a bank, and there are multiple banks in multiple countries who specialize in this kind of thing. You go to a bank and you take out, say, an $8 or $9 million loan using that artifact's value as collateral. So now you have clean money through that loan that is detached from the artifact insofar as the money itself is clean, and you can transport it much more effectively. Another tactic is that you can park that. So you have the artifact, you spend $11 million to get this artifact, and you can park that artifact in free ports, which are basically these giant warehouses that keep assets worth millions. And they exist in certain countries like Switzerland, Singapore, or Luxembourg. It's kind of like the end of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that giant warehouse full of artifacts, but it's like privately owned. different people will store different artifacts there, and the buyer would who wants to buy the artifact just transfers the amount to your bank account, and that money is now clean because it's sourced through the sale of this artifact. And art auctions in general and sales are very, very much anonymized. They're very confidential. They're very classified. So there's not a lot of information for you to track the buyer or the seller. It's a very lucrative business for those who have the know-how, including the banks themselves, who make a lot of money off of it.
Yeah, speaking of free ports, my friend and I were recently in Freeport in the Bahamas for a vacation before COVID, of course. And around Freeport, there are just these tiny little one-room buildings that say on them, like, Merrill Lynch. And those are offshore banking accounts, basically.
Yeah. Oh, it's insane. Like, you walk around and it's like, oh yeah, this definitely looks like the headquarters of a bank.
Yeah, that's the game, That's their Bahamas address that they need to use to launder money.
I don't know where I heard this from, but I heard that there is one building in like, I think it's the Caymans, or the Maldives, that like one like 2 or 3 story building supposedly is the headquarters of like 200 companies.
Probably, yeah. It's basically probably PO boxes for them.
Yeah.
As for our mummy's location, Akbar leads police to the house of Sardar Wali Riki, a camel breeder and head of the 160,000-member Riki tribe. Riki lives in Quetta, Balochistan, a city hundreds of miles north of Karachi, much nearer to the Durand Line, the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Riki confesses to the Pakistani authorities that he received the mummy from an Iranian man named Sharif Shah Baki, and that Riki, Baki, and Ali Akbar had planned to sell the artifact on the black market and split the hefty profit between them. And perhaps, had a stroke of luck not led police to Akbar's video in a separate investigation, they would have gotten away with it. The mummy would be in someone's private collection, and we'd be none the wiser. The conspirators tell police that Sharif Shah Baki, the Iranian man, had found the mummy after an earthquake near his home disturbed the earth. Inside a carved wooden box, a stone sarcophagus held the remains of a gilded mummy that could jolt Pakistan's archaeological community. Authorities take the artifact to Pakistan's National Museum in Karachi so that it can be examined by archaeologists, forensic scientists, and historians. Initial inspections reveal that the mummy's body was that of a woman who once stood at about 4 feet 7 inches tall, about 140 centimeters. She had been embalmed, wrapped in bandages, placed atop some sort of resin made from wax and honey, and put into the sarcophagus. Thus, in most ways, the mummy looks like an ancient Egyptian artifact. But there is a critical difference that catches the eyes of Pakistan's archaeological community. Unlike inscriptions in the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs typical of those burials, this sarcophagus appeared to have an epitaph in cuneiform, the script of the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia, which had been adapted to include more languages like Babylonian and Old Persian. Now, some of our listeners might be thinking, okay, cuneiform, so what? Well, as far as the academic community was aware, until this point, mummification was a funeral process unique to ancient Egypt, and all mummies previously disinterred had been found there.
Now, at this point in time, mummification was considered exclusively an Egyptian domain, but recent discoveries have shown that deliberate mummification, i.e. not accidental through like swamps or bogs, has been practiced across the Americas pre-colonization, along with certain societies in pre-colonial Australia and the Torres Straits. In fact, the oldest mummy ever found dates back to 3500 BC, and it's known as the Chinchorro mummy because it was found in northern Chile and is 2,000 years older than Egyptian mummies. Mummification is having been a practice in local Chinchorro societies, and a practice itself that was duplicated among the Incas, the Aztecs, and other Native American civilizations.
Yeah, it is good to mention that mummification in this sense is just referring to people and animals who have been deliberately embalmed. There are remains of other ancient people like bog bodies and the Iceman that have been preserved due to natural coincidences, but mummies are anthropologically significant because their preservation tells us things like what people in the past valued and thought about the afterlife.
Exactly, yeah.
This recovered mummy, according to the men who were trying to sell it, was buried somewhere near Quetta, Pakistan, far outside Egypt and the borders of any pharaonic kingdom. Some historians surmise, then, that the mummy had been brought at some point from Egypt to Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Iran. But this theory didn't explain the presence of cuneiform rather than hieroglyphs on the coffin. So, archaeologists get to work translating the cuneiform to see if it offers any clues as to who this woman was and why she might have been buried this way. They make another startling discovery. The inscription on the sarcophagus roughly translates to, quote, "I am the daughter of the great King Xerxes. Miserica, protect me. I am Rhodugune, I am." End quote. This means the mummy is about 2,600 years old and that she's not Egyptian. She's an ancient Persian princess.
Dun, dun, dun.
So who is Xerxes? The Achaemenid Empire, also called the First Persian Empire, lasted from about 550 BCE to 330 BCE. King Xerxes I, the ruler mentioned on the princess's sarcophagus, reigned from 486 to 465 BCE. Put into contemporary geographical terms, the empire was based in Iran and encompassed much of the Middle East, but stretched as far west as Libya and as far east as Pakistan.
For our listeners who are familiar with the popular film 300, King Xerxes I is the movie's primary villain, the Persian king with all the chains and gold necklaces and piercings, who invades Greece and ends up being defeated at Thermopylae by a gang of insanely xenophobic slaveholding psychopaths that, for some reason, actually I kind of figure out the reason, Zack Snyder decides to glorify because this movie was released in the middle of the Iraq War. And so the Spartans were the freedom-loving patriots, and the Persian Empire was an evil blob, even though slavery was prohibited in the Persian Empire.
We'll have to analyze this deeper sometime on a bonus episode. Yeah. Regarding the mummy, this means that Xerxes would have ruled over Egypt and possibly had some familiarity with cultural practices there. But compelling to archaeologists is the thought that his own daughter may have been buried in the Egyptian fashion rather than Persian customs. This could tell us a great deal about how the societies of ancient Egypt and ancient Persia interacted with and influenced one another. The Achaemenid dynasty did not practice Egyptian polytheism, but Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest continuously practiced religions in the world, which believes in the supremacy of one specific god above all others, making it a precursor to the notion of a personal monotheistic god like that in the Abrahamic religions.
Ironically enough, a lot of sort of sectarian Sunni Muslims in the Middle East still use not necessarily Zoroastrianism, but basically like the Magi and sun worshippers as a slur against Iranian Shias.
Oh no.
Yeah.
The adoption of Egyptian burial traditions in Persia could thus speak to an intermingling of specific cultural religious practices that archaeologists and historians had not identified. It could be an important piece in the puzzle of humanity's relationship with the metaphysical, our historical journey through conceptions of the afterlife. So, the Persian princess could be a really big deal for archaeologists in the region, and as such, different countries begin fighting over where she belongs. The government of Pakistan claims that she was discovered in Pakistan and that their police were the ones who rescued the remains from the attempted black market sale, and therefore, the mummy belongs to their national museum in Karachi. However, residents of Balochistan, near Quetta, say that the mummy is a piece of their archaeological history and therefore should stay in Quetta rather than Karachi.
Interestingly enough, and I don't want to go into too much of a tangent here, But there is a political animosity between Balochistan, the province, and the Pakistani state, where ethnic Balochis have been engaging in not all of them, of course, but there is an independence movement in Balochistan where ethnic Balochis are requesting or attempting to secede from the Pakistani state and form an independent Balochistan. And so I imagine the struggle over the mummy is part of a deeper struggle against the state in that term.
Yeah, cultural artifacts are pretty much always a part of these struggles.
Yeah, it's who gets to own not just their own history, but who gets to own the process of conveying history to the present.
Right. Meanwhile, the Iranian government asserts that as a Persian princess, the mummy should belong to them, as Iran is the contemporary seat of the Persian Empire. Plus, the man who originally sold the mummy, Sharif Shah Baki, was Iranian and claimed to have found the mummy after an earthquake near his home. Baki was apparently nowhere to be found, but who's to say that he didn't find the princess in Iran before selling her over the border to the men in Pakistan? Even the curator of Pakistan's National Museum acknowledged that this was a possibility. The Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization warns Pakistan that it will cooperate with UNESCO and Interpol to lay claim to the mummy as part of Iran's ancient legacy and bring her to Iran. The government of Pakistan notes that there's no verifiable proof that the mummy came from Iran, and that Pakistan had no intention on damaging or destroying the artifact or giving it away, and they were willing to fight Iran in court to keep it. To make matters even more complicated, in November of 2000, the Taliban's Information and Culture Minister announces that a ring of smugglers have been apprehended and confessed to finding the mummy in Afghanistan's province of Nimroz and selling it to a buyer in Pakistan. Therefore, the Taliban minister insists the Persian princess is rightfully the cultural property of Afghanistan. Keep in mind that this is in the fall of 2000, a year before 9/11, and the Taliban controls 90% of Afghanistan and the governmental functions there. While it might seem strange to us in hindsight that the Taliban would make claims to an artifact on behalf of the Afghan people, it's really not surprising given that the mummy was clearly a valuable cultural relic and its origins were already in dispute. Still, this proclamation by the Taliban really makes me roll my eyes. Oh, you tracked down the smugglers who definitely found the mummy in Afghanistan, but you're unable to produce them or any proof that this actually happened? Cool, we'll just give you the mummy then.
It's weird to me because this is the same group and or government that later ended up blowing up the Buddhas of Bamyan for allegedly being idols. So I'm not sure I would trust these people with a pre-Islamic mummy to safeguard, really.
Yeah, it's a very strange claim to make and makes you wonder why they want it so badly.
Yeah, like I can see Pakistan and Iran laying claims to it, but there is absolutely no reason why Afghanistan should get involved, let alone the Taliban.
But I do see where they saw a dispute was already happening and they sort of thought, if there's any chance that we can claim this valuable thing, we should try to take that chance.
Oh, absolutely. And I have no doubt they would attempt to sell it on the black market for money. The Taliban...
Sell it
the
right
Taliban,
back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Taliban don't strike me as the kind of people who maintain museums to pre-Islamic civilization.
I also think it's interesting that, as far as I can find, Egypt didn't try to claim the mummy, even though, as we discussed before, all previously discovered mummies were Egyptian in origin. I suppose maybe Hosni Mubarak was like, we have enough mummies. Let them fight over one mummy, and I'll just stay here in Egypt, surrounded by our ample supply of mummies.
That is a lot of mummies in one sentence. I never thought I'd hear that sentence, but here we are. So, surprises all over. I don't know about you, but I actually visited the Cairo Museum when I was a kid, and they have a lot of mummies. An amount that borders on excessive. There was an entire section dedicated to mummies in the museum and the process of mummification. And those things look quite terrifying in person because, I don't know, like imagine dying only for your corpse to be gawked at by tourists 2,500 years later. Not really putting peace in the rest in peace.
Yeah, Egypt is full of mummies. At the Golden Mummies of Egypt exhibit that I visited, there was a quote from the British archaeologist Petrie on the wall, and it read, quote, "The plague of gilt mummies continues. Wretched things with gilt faces and painted headpieces," end quote. Like, why is the Egyptologist so angry that they keep digging up mummies at an ancient burial ground in Egypt?
I feel like there's a surprised Pikachu face here where he just keeps digging into like pyramids, and it's like, God damn it, why are there these mummies in these pyramids again?
Yeah, and I imagine Mrs. Petrie being like, "Hey, honey, how was work?" And he's like, "Oh, it was shite. We found another fucking mummy." Also, there is a Wikipedia page called List of Mummies that I stumbled across trying to find out how many mummies there actually are in the world. And literally the second entry on the mummy list is Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher and writer of Panopticon. And there's an attached picture of what appears to be a wax figure sitting on a chair. And I was like, oh no, please do not be what I think it is. But yes, parts of Jeremy Bentham's mummified corpse, supplemented by wax replicas, are on display at the University College London. His embalmed body is sitting on a chair behind a glass wall in the student center. What the fuck?
That is the fuel for nightmares.
When I die, I want you to mummify my remains and prop me up at the end of my favorite cocktail bar, French 75 in hand, and then everyone will be like, "Yeah, that's Erin. She used to drink here and talk about the failures of liberal feminism, and this could be my legacy."
If you die before me, I will make sure that happens. But if I die before you, just throw me in the trash. I really don't much care for what happens to my corpse.
I really don't either. I'm a registered organ donor, but other than
Same.
that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the disputes over the origin of the mummy also led to complications in insuring it. Companies don't want to insure the mummy in Pakistan, for instance, if Interpol is going to seize it and send it to Tehran. Furthermore, uncertain monetary values can be nightmares for insurance processes. Then, another development in the origins of the Persian princess once again leaves the archaeological community stunned. Oscar White Muscarella, a senior research fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and an expert in artifacts from the ancient Near East, specifically ancient Persia, makes some pretty damning claims to Archaeology magazine. In an interview that was meant to focus on his book about forgery culture titled The Lie Became Great, Muscarella, a researcher known for calling out the detrimental effects of archaeological looting, tells the writers at Archaeology that the Persian princess sounds suspiciously similar to a mummy that a dealer allegedly from New Jersey had tried to sell the Met several months before. According to Romy and Rose at Archaeology, quote, Muscarella had received 4 photographs of a mummy in a wooden coffin, replete with golden crown, mask, and inscribed breastplate. An accompanying letter stated that the mummy was owned by a Pakistani acquaintance and was brought by Zoroastrian families many years ago from Iran to Pakistan. The author claimed that the mummy was the daughter of the Persian king Xerxes, referring to an attached 1-page translation of the cuneiform inscription on the breastplate. The owners, he wrote, had a video of the mummy, most likely the same video with Ali Akbar in Karachi, that could be sent to New York if the museum was interested in purchasing the princess. End quote. But Muscarella, again an authority on ancient Persian artifacts, notices some dubious properties in the mummy, such as linguistics in the cuneiform which were not consistent with the time frame during which the Persian princess allegedly died. Muscarella suspects a forgery, cuts contact with the seller, and notifies Interpol of what he believes to be a fraudulent antiquity. This leads to the archaeological community taking a much more critical look at the Persian princess, and those at the National Museum in Pakistan begin to detect some of the inconsistencies that Muscarella had warned about. First, as Muscarella had noted, carbon dating showed that the wooden coffin, which housed the Persian princess's ornate sarcophagus, was only about 250 years old. Further testing determined that the mat upon which she had been placed was only about 5 years old.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think it's totally unheard of for sarcophagi to be moved into newer coffins, whether for transport or refurbishment. Not saying Muscarella is wrong here. Obviously, from what he says, it's a fake. But I do think the mat is much more glaring error than the coffin.
More damning, however, was the removal of the Persian princess's heart. In many ways, she had been mummified in the ancient Egyptian fashion. Her internal organs were removed, and her arms were placed over her chest before she was wrapped in bandages and placed into a sarcophagus. But the ancient Egyptians always left the heart in the body, believing it to hold the essence of a person's thinking and being.
Well, of course they're idiots because, centuries later, scientists have shown that the brain governs the essence of a person's thinking, and the penis governs the essence of a man's thinking, as per renowned biologist Valerie Solanas.
She's so relevant.
She's always relevant. Everything goes back to Valerie Solanas. Ancient mummies, Valerie Solanas. Heist, Valerie Solanas. CIA Contra, Valerie Solanas.
Additionally, the mummification process itself seemed a bit botched, with errors in incisions. Ancient Egyptian embalmers were extremely skilled in their craft, and only the best would have been trusted with the body of a princess. Then, researchers noticed that whomever had written the cuneiform inscription on the casket had used the Greek form of the name, Rhodugune, rather than its Persian form, Rhodugune. Why would the Persians include a foreign version of a princess's name on her epitaph? Regardless, the Greeks had not conquered Persia until long after Rhodugune died, and thus the Greek cuneiform version of her name would not yet have existed at the time of her mummification.
Look, Pexit means Pexit. Out means out. I've had enough with those Athenian bureaucrats forcing us to use Greek versions of our names and ruining our culture. Let Persia leave the Greeks. Leave means leave.
Archaeologists also noticed lead pencil marks on the inside of the casket, as though someone had perhaps tried to trace some of the details and had not been able to totally erase their practice marks. Lead pencils were not invented until about 200 years ago, and certainly weren't around in ancient Persia. Finally, forensic scientists examining the mummy concluded that she could not have died more than a few years ago, as her tendons, specifically those in her ears, had not yet deteriorated. And even with the best embalming technique applied, tendons will deteriorate over time, especially over thousands of years. So, researchers concluded that the Persian princess mummy, the antiquity that three powers were fighting to possess, was, in fact, a forgery. So the question now becomes, who is the woman inside the sarcophagus? And how did she get there?
Dun dun dun!
The tests like CT scans that experts had already ran on the mummy tell us a little bit about who she was. The body is definitely that of a woman, short in stature, again, about 4'7", who likely died when she was around 21 to 24 years old, though some sources say it's possible that she was middle-aged. She probably died around 1996, 4 years before the mummy was confiscated by police, but was embalmed shortly following her death. Her hair had likely been bleached blonde, possibly when she was alive, or perhaps as an unintended side effect of exposure to the embalming chemicals. Her teeth had been removed during the mummification process, making a dental identification pretty much impossible. Scientists also determined that the woman's cause of death was probably a spinal injury from some sort of blunt force, possibly like being struck by a vehicle or falling from a fatal height. They were unable to conclude the exact circumstances of her death, like whether it had been an accident or a homicide. Other than that, this woman, her name, life, and story, has not been identified, and once it was established that she was not an ancient Persian princess, lots of the world stopped caring. The mummy was removed from Pakistan's National Museum, and a charity called the Eddy Foundation gave the woman a proper but anonymous burial in 2008.
The Eddy Foundation is actually quite a remarkable organization. And again, not to diverge much, but I do recommend that folks look into them. They provide medical care and ambulance services to Pakistan's poorest communities. Quite an admirable group.
There are a few theories circulating on true crime forums about how the young woman's body fell into the hands of forgers. The first, and perhaps most sensational, is murder. That is, a ring of antiquities forgers killed a young woman to use her body in the creation of a fraudulent mummy. I'll go over the points that, in my opinion, support this theory before I go over those which call it into question. First, the cause of death does support the possibility of foul play. If the young woman had died from natural causes, murder would pretty much be out of the question. But a spinal injury is definitely something that can be caused from an act like pushing someone down the stairs. Normally, I'd say it's a pretty big leap from forgery to murder, but let's not forget that there was the potential to make a lot of money from the Persian princess. And where there's profit, there's motive.
Yeah, $1 billion is exactly 1 billion reasons for someone to kill someone else.
Or even 11 million. Like, sadly, people have killed for a lot less.
Yeah.
Not that you should ever kill anyone for any amount of money, of course, but
we're not condoning this.
Additionally, the fact that Ali Akbar was already a person of interest in a murder investigation when Pakistani police stumbled upon the videotape of him trying to sell the mummy does not look good for him. But the police claim that they were investigating the mummified woman's death as a murder and that they would charge Akbar and one of his accomplices, Riki, with the crime. But as far as I can tell from the news available, the men never ended up being charged for the woman's murder. They were only held for the smuggling charges. Moreover, unless she came from a marginalized and therefore less visible community, or perhaps was related to her killers and didn't know many people outside that situation, this young woman's disappearance or murder wouldn't go unnoticed. It's extremely unlikely that forgers would just snatch a random person to create a mummy out of them. People would start looking for their loved one, and it would draw police attention to the forgers.
I mean, to be fair, places like Karachi are notorious for kidnap and murder. And I don't want to go full like Orientalist here, but even like Bogota during the 90s or Karachi even now, there are cities where, unfortunately, a woman being kidnapped and murdered right off the street may raise questions by her family, but these things happen with enough frequency that it wouldn't entirely be breaking news. And if this is a highly sophisticated criminal ring, which it doesn't sound like it is, but if it's even remotely complex, then I assume that the corrupt local police force would have either been bribed or just genuinely too incompetent to investigate.
Plus, it is possible that the woman does come from a marginalized community, and therefore nobody realized that she vanished. For instance, human trafficking does happen around the world, especially in places with a significant number of refugees like Iran and Pakistan. It's so awful to think about, but perhaps the woman was trafficked and sold into an antiquities forging ring. I really, really hope that's not the case, but unfortunately, it can't be ruled out. But it's also possible that the woman died by accident and her family sold her body to some sketchy people. Maybe they knew that it would be used for an antiquities hoax, or maybe they had no idea. But poverty can force some people to do some really desperate things. If this is the case, it makes sense why the family wouldn't come forward after the Persian princess fiasco. Why would they? It would probably just lead to them being harassed by the media and re-traumatized.
Okay, not to make light of a very grim situation, but let me rephrase my earlier assessment. When I die, I give you, my dear friends, full permission to mummify me and try to pass me off as a real artifact. And if it works, then let my death be a boon for all of you, because if you all become millionaires over my corpse, then I'm perfectly happy to, help out.
The Toronto mummy?
Yeah.
Another feasible means of obtaining a body is through grave robbing. This is one of the more likely scenarios, in my opinion. People have pointed out that the embalming process must start soon after death to work. But in traditional Islamic burials, and most people in Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan are Muslim, people are laid to rest within 24 hours of their death, and sometimes even just a few hours later. I'd imagine this wouldn't be too difficult, especially if the forgers had an insider working somewhere like a hospital or cemetery to alert them to recent deaths of people matching a certain description. Assuming they had perhaps already started planning or making parts of the forgery like the cuneiform coffin, they'd be looking for a woman, probably on the shorter side as people were shorter back in the day, and she couldn't have died from a modern cause like a gunshot wound.
I can imagine a forensic scientist or archaeologist just looking over this mummy and is like, this wound suspiciously looks like it came from a Glock 22.
Another potential factor that I thought of that I haven't seen mentioned anywhere else, so perhaps I'm just totally off the mark here, is what if the young woman was Hindu or Sikh and her family believes that she was cremated? Pakistan does have a Hindu population of several million and a very small minority of Sikhs, and unlike Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs cremate their dead. In Hinduism, these last rites are called antyesti, and usually involve a funeral procession and cremation ceremony, though restrictions in Pakistan have made it difficult for people to cremate their family members if they so wish, which is a big issue on its own. But here in the United States, cremation is typically done in a more secluded chamber, at a mortuary, and then you receive the ashes of your loved one later. So maybe this young woman's family expected her to be cremated somewhere like that, but during the process, somebody stole her body and sent her family ashes from a bonfire or something like that. It's a stretch, but I don't think it's impossible. It's also somewhat surprising to me how the discovery of the forged mummy didn't bring more of the fraudulent antiquities ring down. Yes, 2 of the smugglers were arrested for that crime, but it seems like they were ruled out as the actual forgers. Meanwhile, the Iranian guy they claimed to have gotten the mummy from never surfaced, nor did any of the dealers trying to contact Oscar White Muscarella. My personal theory is that these forgers operate in a network, like pretty much any organized crime syndicate. Clearly, they must have some educated people with specialized knowledge in ancient Egyptian and Persian cultures. That's how they were able to plan the mummification, cuneiform, the link to Xerxes, etc. I'm guessing that there are some people in high positions at museums and universities who have a nice little side job going in antiquities forging, and Muscarella believes the same. Next, whoever carried this out has to have some financial resources. Part of the mummy was literally plated in gold. That kind of stuff doesn't come cheap, and it would take some amount of investment to create a convincing forgery before trying to sell it. Perhaps the financiers and the antiquities scholars are one and the same, or maybe they're working in cahoots. My point is that this was clearly a sophisticated operation.
And going back to my earlier point on money laundering, it seems that there are much deeper roots to this than meets the eye. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if this is an international or at least regional operation, and I also wouldn't be surprised if government officials are involved, because to move these very, very unique and easily identifiable rarities, bribes must definitely be made in the right places.
Yes, and then you've got the henchmen. These are your body snatchers and your run-of-the-mill smugglers. I think there's a distinct possibility that the people who actually performed the mummification lacked anatomical knowledge and were merely acting on instructions from the scholar group, thus mistakenly removing the heart. I also think their huge mistake here was flying too close to the sun. The Persian princess would have genuinely been a huge archaeological find, and trying to pass it off as genuine to someone like Muscarella at the Met would surely bring a high level of scrutiny. If they had stuck to more mundane antiquities like clay tablets, pottery, maybe some small statues, and simply sold these to wealthy private collectors, they probably would have gone largely unnoticed.
Yeah, it was incredibly stupid of them to try and pass off this mummy as the Persian princess, daughter of Xerxes I, at a time when mummification was assumed to be a strictly Egyptian practice, because, like you said, this discovery would have been a game changer. And it would have just opened a huge can of worms among historians and archaeologists. I can imagine countless scholars across the world would have wanted to come down to visit and study this mummy to determine, cultural and economic links between Egypt and Persia and the sociological impact of this discovery. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a criminal mastermind, so take my advice with a grain of salt. But if you're really hell-bent on forging a mummy, just try passing it off as an Egyptian mummy. I mean, if there are 1,000 Egyptian mummies, 1,001 wouldn't make that big of a difference, and no one is going to be analyzing every little nook and cranny. Maybe the loss of so many ancient Egyptian treasures during, the 20th century with grave robbers and so on. You can just be like, yeah, we found this mummy and, it was stolen, but then we found it and just, we'll sell it to you guys for so-and-so money instead of passing off something entirely brand new.
Yeah, I agree. Still, though this tale is an extremely gripping one, I think it's ultimately very sad as well. This young woman probably died a tragic death, whether by accident or murder, and then rose to fame in death as an ancient princess before once again returning to anonymous obscurity. I hope that if her family is out there, they're doing okay and that their loved one is resting in peace. So, dear listeners, please let us know what you think about this whole saga. Do you think that the mummified woman was a victim of murder? Do you also suspect that antiquities forging goes all the way to the top in terms of museums and academia? Thanks to you who gave us feedback about the Ancient True Crime miniseries. You guys said that you really like this format, so we're definitely going to explore it more in the future.
Yeah, and please do support our pod. We have a Patreon going, www.patreon.com/dascriminal. The link is in the description, as always. We have full-length bonus episode next week. New subscribers can also get access to our back catalog of bonus episodes, including 4 full-length episodes that you can't hear anywhere else. And they're about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Black Plague, the Oxfam exploitation scandal in Haiti, and the way Al-Qaeda launders money using honey shops. And of course, that includes fascinating bee facts from your resident bee expert, Erin. So if any of these topics interest you, check us out. And every month, we definitely add more.
We also do a current events and cultural criticism series over there called Current Criminal. We've discussed it, and we're going to concentrate a decent portion of our Patreon money into improving that segment. So please check us out as well.
And if you're wondering, your lovely Patreon money, of which I am truly grateful, has recently funded my purchase of a new desk chair with lumbar support. So I can, in theory, sit here for an infinite amount of time recording podcasts for you guys, our dear listeners. So thank you very much.
You can also find us on Instagram at DasCriminalPod, where we post relevant photos and maps. I will post some photos from my museum trip so you can see that kind of stuff. And if you like the pod, please do subscribe, leave us a review, and tell your friends because that helps so much for us to get noticed.
Yeah, and until next time, hope you have a good week, everyone.
See you next Monday.
Au revoir.
Bye.